In my previous video, I outlined how Ron Paul and Peter Schiff keep on talking about a dollar collapse or nasty inflation to occur because of what the Federal Reserve is doing in monetizing all of this debt and with QE to infinity. Well, they may be right in the long run, but the short term, we have to remember central planners are in charge and they can do whatever to rig markets, or they can change the rules of the game. And this is what many people fail to acknowledge. However, it's in my belief that they will be right in the next decade or two, or even within the next few years, that we could potentially see the nasty inflation. Another point to note is that there are many individuals who trade that could care less about what's going to happen in the next decade. They only care about what's going to happen on a day-to-day situation. And I completely understand that scenario, as I'm starting to trade more often these days, or trade more than I did in the past. And it completely makes sense why some people are going to be bashing on guys like Schiff and Paul, saying that there's no hyperinflation, these guys are crackpots, so on and so on. So that's another thing to note. But let's just look at some economic historians who talked about it, or these economists in the past that discussed long-term solutions, but they were just usually ignored or disregarded. This book is The History of the Federal Reserve, Volume 1, 1913-1951, Alan Meltzer. So, he talked about one economist, Henry Thornton, just as a background, and then free market guy, David Ricardo. And let's get into this paragraph. Why did Thornton's rich and promising analysis degenerate first into a Bank of England policy using bank rate mainly to protect the gold reserve, and later into the Federal Reserve's concern for short-term market interest rates and money market conditions? Let's go down to the third reason. Third, David Ricardo, and many of his followers not only failed to address the questions uppermost in the minds of the practitioners, but failed to make it clear that they were not addressing these questions. Ricardo's analysis is entirely long-run comparative statics, and his policy recommendations consisted mainly of a set of rules for restoring and maintaining convertibility into gold at a fixed exchange rate. Important as his work for economic theory, it gave very little guidance to the Bank of England on the issues of greatest concern to its directors. The governors and directors of BOE were concerned with the profits of the bank and the avoidance of panic and the appropriate response to short-term changes. For example, an increased demand for borrowing by the country banks or from banks abroad. Let's look at this. It talks about how David Ricardo was recommending long-term policy changes. While they may not have been satisfactory in the short term, in the long term, it would have been the best case scenario. Now, if you're looking at the Bank of England, they were only cared about the short-term solutions. They care about, number one, going to the markets, rigging the markets, and they're looking at which country banks are borrowing and how they could set their interest rates, right? This is what they're concerned about. They're not concerned about long-term scenarios that could hurt the middle class by rigging interest rates, not improving, but implementing all this money printing, so on and so on. So you have to remember, guys like Ricardo are long-term guys. Guys in the central bank are short-term individuals. It's a basic concept, just like you see today. What Schiff and Paul are talking about are solutions to help the economy in the long run. Short term, it could probably be a disaster, right? You could probably see a nasty economy for a year or so if it's done the right way. But they're not going to do that. They're not going to cut spending by 30%. They're not going to cut taxes. They're not going to have a flat tax, something like that. They're not going to decrease all these rules and regulations. This goes on and on. I mean, if we did have a free market economy, or more of a free market economy, this economy would soar. You would see less unemployed people right now. Okay, so let's look at this other author, Austrian school individual Henry Hazlitt. He wrote this book, From Bretton Woods to World Inflation, in the 1980s. He chronicled all of the articles that he wrote at the New York Times in the 40s talking about how this Bretton Woods gold exchange standard would be a disaster. It would break up. And it eventually did. And he chronicles it in this book. And he was virtually ignored. And let's take an excerpt of what he talked about in the book. And you have to remember, he wrote for the New York Times, which was an ultra-liberal paper at that time. Or which was a liberal paper. Just imagine a guy like Hazlitt working for them now. Wouldn't happen because Krugman's in charge there at the New York Times. And there'd be no way you'd see a guy on the far right like Hazlitt right there. All you see is wackiness coming from Krugman. But anyways, let's look at what was said. Yet obvious as these dangers should have been, even in 1944, so to those who bothered to read the text of the Bretton Woods agreements, I found myself almost done, particularly in the journalistic world, in calling attention to them. My editorials at the time, the few persons and groups who did. Okay, let's scroll down. Let us, at the cost of repetition, remind ourselves of what really went wrong. The Bretton Woods agreements never seriously considered the return of each signatory nation to a gold standard. Lord Keynes, their principal author, even boasted that they set up the exact opposite of a gold standard. In any case, what Bretton Woods really set up was what used to be called a gold exchange standard. Every other country in the scheme undertook simply to keep its own currency unit convertible into dollars. The United States alone undertook, on the demand of foreign central banks, to keep its own currency unit directionally convertible into gold. Neither the politicians of foreign countries nor, unfortunately, of our own realized the awesome responsibility that this scheme put on the American banking and currency authorities to refrain from excessive credit expansion. The result was that when Nixon closed the American gold window on August 15, 1971, our gold reserves amounted to only about 2% of our outstanding currency in demand, and bank deposits, 10 million or 10.132 million of gold versus 454 million of M2. In other words, there was only $2.23 in gold to redeem every $100 of paper promises. So, long story short, Henry Hazlitt summarized what he knew in the 1940s was wrong with the gold exchange standard, and we could repeat this one line again that he talked about on page 10. Yet obvious as these dangers should have been, even in 1944, to those who bothered to read the text of the Bretton Woods agreements, I found myself almost alone. He was almost alone, and he predicted this, and he was ignored, right? At least he had a platform on the New York Times, though. That's a positive note. Now going back to Ron Paul and Schiff, Blue Rockwell, Tom Woods, etc., they're calling for nastier inflation to come about. And the thing is that, yeah, it could happen, but maybe not right now. Central planners are in charge. I mean, going back to Henry Hazlitt, he wrote about the collapse, or he wrote about problems with the Bretton Woods gold exchange standard in 1945. When did it collapse? It collapsed 26 years later, 1971. It took 26 years. Not that I'm saying that this dollar collapse is going to happen in 26 years. What I'm saying is, a lot of people are talking about, hey, it could happen tomorrow. I even told these guys that are interviewed, such as Ranting Andy, Gregory Mannarino, that, you know what, this thing could take some time. I agree with your thesis about the size of government. I don't like Federal Reserve quantitative easing, but hold on a second. It doesn't necessarily have to happen as of right now. I mean, Ranting Andy was telling me that this thing is going to go down as of this year. I told him in an interview, I forget which one, it's still up, posted, that this thing could take a little longer than what you're talking about. You talked about collapse this year. Alistair MacLeod told me collapse this year. I said no, it's going to be probably postponed. And yeah, we haven't seen collapse this year. So that's why I see them kicking the can down the road. I don't know what they're exactly going to do, but it looks like central planners have tricks up their sleeves, and many people are, unfortunately, those who are financially sophisticated and understand the Austrian school, they may be wrong in the short term. Long run, I suspect that they will be right.